Well, welcome to class. Starting 9 minutes late here. Now, first thing that I want to do is that to kind of go over the course content here, the syllabus, and then we'll get into what we're going to do today. I think I might close the door here just to reduce sound. Sometimes it gets pretty noisy in this hallway. So what I was doing right there, one of the things that I was doing, and it didn't have anything to do with the noise that was created, was to set up a recording. I like to record my lectures so that you guys can go watch them later. And it's something that I've been doing. So if you all are in my classes, before you've seen that. Okay, so I'll record them, I'll post them to YouTube. Now sometimes the video doesn't work, and sometimes it works, but there's like a delay or feedback. I can usually tell now if there's going to be a feedback here, but it looks like it's working well. But sometimes there's a delay, so they're a little frustrating to watch. It's not perfect technology, but it'd be great if you could be here most of the time, and use the lectures, the recorded lectures, mostly as a supplement or a refresh. All right. So yeah, all the course content is up on Canvas. I had loaded it in. My contact information's here. In the in SOAR, it says that we meet until what, like 8 o'clock at night or something like that. In practice, we won't actually meet that late. We don't need to meet that late. It's just the structure of the reservation system that creates it that long. Technically, we need to meet, because this is a 2-hour class coupled with a 2-hour lab. So technically, we need to meet for a little over 2 hours for the lecture part, and then there's to be about 4 hours of lab time. So that's about 6 hours, and that's from that's starting at 1:15, and so we'll get out about 3:30, 2 hours later, about 2 hours later, and then we'll have a 10-minute break usually, and then we'll do the lab. Now in practice, the lab is usually going to be an exercise where I present it, I talk about it, and then I leave you to do it, okay? And then you'll be asking me questions. So it's kind of open-ended at the end. So, that'd be about 7 something that it usually runs to, but in reality, I'll leave when the last person leaves and isn't here anymore. So you don't have to stick around for the entire time, but yeah, you're certainly welcome to. And so it's not all of that. What I'm trying to say is not all of the lab is structured instruction, and that's why it's called a lab. So at most about half of that, 2 hours and 2 hours, and then there's the university schedules that in for that reason. So I don't know if that's similar to other labs that you've had on campus, but that's the way it works for most of the classes that I teach in the past. So you can reasonably assume that on a normal week you don't have to even ask me, say, hey, I got an appointment at 6 o'clock, I need to be somewhere at dinner. If you're comfortable just sticking around for the structured part of the lab and you need to leave, typically we'll be done at around 6 o'clock at night. Okay, today we'll end earlier. I'll discuss some of the reasons for that, but we'll definitely do that. Okay, so this course is a second level course in GIS. And so the first thing is that I'm skipping down to the prerequisites here. I assume that you've taken Geography 217 here at this university, or acquire the equivalent knowledge. Now, we usually allow graduate students to jump right into this course. I know we have a student up here in that scenario, because they can catch up, and there's certainly that ability for an undergraduate. So if you never had a GIS course, I would typically recommend that you take it, since we have that available here. But there are other ways that you could get that. I could recommend some reading material. And one of the other great resources that we have here is the ability to take some online ESRI courses. And I can do that. I can do that for anybody here. You can sign up once you have an account. Speaking of accounts, we are going to be using ESRI software this semester. Now I keep going further down the syllabus when I should. I'll introduce them when I talk about the course. But who here has a ArcGIS online account with the university? I wonder if I can make that big for a second. I want to see you guys. I can't see you guys very well down there on the coast, but I don't know how to fix it. So we'll just have to suffer through it. In one of the things they're doing in our new lab is that we're going to have a separate TV just for seeing you guys. It's going to be in the back of the room. So we'll have a better setup starting next week. They were supposed to do this over the break, but they didn't quite get to it. So anyway, rather than ask for hands, I'll just switch to SOAR, and I'm going to look at the people here, which, I don't know, maybe I should go like this. I don't know if, I think ID, well, anyway, I've already done it now at this point. I'll try to go edit that part out of the video. But we've got, I'm searching for cars, trying to buy new cars on my other one. My son crashed my car at the end of the last semester. Still looking. Yeah. All right, so these are all the students. And what I'm going to do is open a tab here. And we're going to be using a software package called ArcGIS Pro instead of ArcGIS Desktop. So one of the things that I'm doing each week is I'll be rewriting the material in order to compensate for this new software package, which I know was installed on the computers because we used it last semester down there. So it's installed on both sets of computers. But it's licensed differently in that you need to have your own login and password in order to use it. So if you've taken a course where you've used ArcGIS Pro before, you don't need to do anything. But what I'd like to do, since there's so few students in here, is make sure that we are all set up to use ArcGIS Pro. And you need to be a member of our ArcGIS Online account to do that. So I'm going to invite some new members. And what I'm going to do is switch back to this one. Ashley, too, because you're brand new. Are you still there, Ashley?
She walked out.
Okay. I'll handle her second. So I know up here, Daniel and Forrest already have an account. Veronica, you already have an account, right?
Yes.
And Nick already has an account. Nick, are you there?
Yes, sir.
Sorry, like I said, right now you're about 6 inches by 12-inch square. So each person is less than an inch up here. So I can't see. Okay. All right. Michael, do you know if you have an account yet? Are you there?
I don't think so.
Okay. All right. So let's add the members and invite them to use an account of your choice. So I'm going to do this option, and what you'll have to do is you'll have to create a an account or convert your existing ArcGIS account. If you already have an ArcGIS account, you're all set. So I'm going to do that real quick. Actually, let's just do that after class, because this will be hard. Plus, I don't know if everybody wants to share their email address over. I've got a pen, and I'll just write down everybody's that knows that they don't have an account real quick. Plus, they'll take less time.
Question, sir.
Yeah.
Okay, look, if you had a ArcGIS desktop, you didn't get the pro account this semester, correct?
Right. I was going to cover that in a second. So, if you want to run it on your own computer, I have to send you something as well. So what you do is anybody that doesn't have an account, send me an email and tell me whether you want to run the software on your own computer, and I'll send you a license for that. So I think that's Michael, and John, I think you need one too. Anybody else need how about Roy? Roy, are you there?
I think I need one as well.
Okay. If you haven't used ArcGIS Pro, then you're going to need one.
Yeah.
Roy, Carol.
The license is for Pro?
Yeah, ArcGIS Pro. And then Elvis, are you there?
I need one.
All right. Elvis, do you go? Is that what you go by?
Yes, sir.
All right.
He still wants to send you an email as well.
Yes. Send me an email and I'll just use the email address you send. And then it looks like the last one on here is Aaron. Aaron, are you there?
Yes, I need one.
Okay. Yep. Those are the names So Aaron, John, Elvis, and Roy, you've not been in one of my classes before, I don't think. Sometimes it's hard to see people on the coast. And maybe even Michael. Or Michael, were you in my class last semester? Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, so we got people I got a bunch of new students. That's great. All right. So, yeah, send me an email. My email is on the syllabus, which I'll go back to now. All right. Yep. So this course is called Spatial Analysis and Modeling, and we're going to be focusing specifically on GIS modeling in raster, using the raster data model, which a brief summary of that is rows and columns of numbers, conceptualizing the world as rows and columns of numbers. So here I'll bring up the lecture in a minute after I go through the rest of this. There aren't any readings that you have to purchase for this class. I'll be posting them up on Canvas. I have a few scattered journal articles and a few scattered book chapters, but I'm not using the entire book for any course this semester. So there's nothing to purchase in that regard. The course schedule is a little bit condensed. The university got rid of one of the weeks of the class. Is that right? Is David still there, or did he leave too?
You walked out.
Okay. Yeah, so it's 1 or 2 weeks that they got rid of. And because of the way the semester's set up this semester, there's actually only 14 weeks, and one of them spring breaks. There's only 13 meeting times. So typically in a once-a-week class, before the change, we had 16 meeting times. Now we're down to 13 meeting times. Oh, sorry. With the final, it's typically with the final is 16, and now we're down to 14. So we're missing 2 meeting times from the way it's normally set up. But we're going to discuss a lot of different things. there's a lot of cool topics. I enjoy teaching this class, and it's a class I've taught for a long time, but I have to continually update it. So there are some new lectures. There's a lecture that I threw out, some lectures that I added, and like I said, since we're using a new software package, I'm redoing the lab exercises each week. Initially, I didn't even have a lab exercise the first week, so I'm writing the lab exercise for today. I'm almost done with that one. I was going to be done, but they roped me into taking all the computers out of that other lab. Okay, so we took care of this. We are going to be utilizing ArcGIS Pro. Almost everything that we do in this class, you could do in a different software package. There's free and open source software packages like QGIS, and there are older versions of ArcGIS like ArcMap that you might be familiar with if you've used those in your classes before. ArcGIS Pro will eventually replace ArcMap, and so I think it's important to utilize it. It is faster. It works faster. It's built on a modern 64-bit architecture, so it works better, and so it's also important to do that. Now they will be installed on all the computers, but it'll also be nice to have them on our laptops if you want, or your desktop. Your desktop needs to be, not ancient in order for it to work. You can go read about the exact requirements to run. You can just type in Google ArcGIS Pro minimum hardware requirements, and you can find out if your machine fits that. So we're going to have a lab exercise every week, and typically I am fairly generous in turning in late assignments. I shouldn't call myself generous. I'm such a nice guy, but I don't take off that much. So if you want to turn it in 1 week late, take off a point, which is the equivalent of like a 10%, like a letter grade. But if you talk to me, usually that's the most I ever take off. If you talk to me about why it happened or whatnot. This only applies to the graduate students, which are the two students up here. You do have to do a paper and a project, and I'll meet with you guys separately about that. In this class, there's no undergraduate project. So some of the labs will get more project-like at the end, but there's no separate project. All right, y'all can read the disability and the academic integrity pay information whenever you want. All right, so that's the syllabus. If anybody has any questions, bring them up now or at the end of class. It's fine with me. Close that off. All right. Now, if you go to the modules section, I will eventually have all the course content up here, and I do want to try to put it up as quickly as possible. Like I said, this semester it is a class I've taught before, but there are some changes. So even what I put up might change before the actual class time. But I have the materials already for all 4 of these classes. I just need to put them up, except for the labs. I haven't fixed that yet. One thing that you might want to do right now is to download these 2 data sets right here if you want to follow along. I'll be demonstrating from those data sets. I've already downloaded them. But you guys can't get into ArcGIS Pro until you have a sign-on. So maybe we should just take a few-minute break after I start with the lecture and before I start some of the demonstrations. And then if you want to follow along, you can log in to ArcGIS Pro. So I'm going to download the lecture here. I just didn't want to have all that material up on the video, like with everybody's email addresses and stuff. What's that? Oh, the HiCom data, yeah. So we use some of that. All right, so you guys can see the lecture down there?
Yes.
Yep. So this is a very old definition of GIS, and it's a slide that I used in lots of other classes, so you may have seen it before, especially if, Jocelyn borrowed some of my slides for the intro class. But one of the, and you'll see this in the reading as well for today, one of the ways to think about GIS is that it can be a toolbox for spatial data. An automated system for the capture, storage, retrieval, and analysis and display of spatial data. This class is really going to be mostly about analysis, but we are going to talk a little bit about display today. And cartography would be a full course just about the display of spatial data. But one of the revolutionary ideas in GIS is that we have a single software package or a single software stack specifically devoted to all of these activities that we could capture, store, retrieve, and analyze and display spatial data. So one of the things that when we talk about spatial analysis, what do we mean here? Well, we'll do some of this today, but we're talking about taking a spatial layer like you did in hopefully in your introductory GIS class. What's a thematic layer in GIS? Like, give me an example of that. Anybody? Yeah, elevation. In fact, that's the one that's up here, right here. Go back to the first slide here real quick. This data set is an elevation data set of the state of Mississippi. So that's a thematic layer. So input would be a thematic layer, and then a spatial operation is something I'm going to do with that. Hopefully you got some practice doing that in your introductory GIS class. But a spatial operation that I might do on a elevation layer is try to, let's say, find all of the areas in Mississippi that are above a certain elevation, or maybe I just want to find the maximum elevation in Mississippi. But do you know what that is? Yeah.
So Woodall.
Yeah, Mount Woodall. It's like way up in this corner up here somewhere, right? Because that's the closest area to Tennessee. So the spatial operation would be to find the maximum value inside of that data set, right? So this should be a review, but that's the kind of stuff we'll talk about this semester. So, and the idea is we chain these things together, these spatial operations, and we get a final output layer. Why do we want to do this? We can do GIS modeling. And we'll talk about modeling a little bit more next week, but there's really two types of models that we talk about, and both are a simplified representation of reality. This layer itself, right, this map of Mississippi, this data set, is a simplified version of reality. In reality, the landscape of Mississippi changes and changes in elevation. But we don't, there's lots of things that we don't see on that map. I haven't included vegetation. I haven't included roads or whatnot. So it's just part of reality. On top of that, if we were to zoom in, we would notice that we've actually modeled the elevation as a set of grid cells where everything in that grid cell has the same value. In reality, we know that that doesn't look like that. It would look like Minecraft. Anybody play Minecraft? My son does. So It's like this, so everything's made up of little building blocks that have various elevations. So during this class, we're going to talk about cartographic modeling, map algebra. We're really going to hit that hard next week. We're going to go do terrain analysis. We're going to do spatial estimation or interpolation. Talk about data quality and uncertainty, all of these topics. Now, this is a slide that I used to include a lot, but I think I included it in my my vector class, and it probably actually fits better in the vector class. But this is some early spatial analysis using the scientist John Snow back in the 1800s was an epidemiologist. In this case, he was looking at the connections between cholera and well locations. And just very briefly, I'll summarize. It wasn't like as straightforward as you might think. Oh, well, here's all the well locations, and here's all the cholera outbreaks. Therefore, I'm going to say that you get cholera from the water from this well. It took a lot of pretty modern GIS ideas, including something that we would refer to as geocoding, taking an address and turning it into a dot on the map. It might be hard to see for you all, but there's dots representing all the cholera outbreaks. And then doing some additional analysis, including what we would call network analysis today, to actually map travel time along each of those streets to each of the pumps. The pumps are the darker P's. And then it actually took a lot of cartographic work to convince the local governments and agencies responsible for distributing the water to finally put a stop to. They took the handle off of that pump so that people would stop getting cholera. But it's an early example of spatial analysis, and it's a problem that actually spans this raster and vector relationship. But I've got a better example that I'll probably show now, but I'll probably show next week. But there's a couple of good videos on YouTube that explain this, and you can kind of see how this was a very geographic problem. Anyway, we talked about what a data layer is. A data layer is one GIS, one layer that can be used in a map, one set of unique information that shares a common theme. In the old days, we used to actually call them themes. That's what one of the earlier versions of GIS. It was actually also called ArcView, but it was its own software package. It wasn't just a version of ArcMap. It would call them themes. So each theme was a different idea. Like you've already said, elevation. We could also have temperature. We could have precipitation. We could have roads. So why do we use layers? Well, not only does it help us keep things organized, having layers helps us to compartmentalize and generalize the world. So we have a very complex world. If we can break it down into different thematic elements, we can then model how those layers are combined in order to answer questions. So here's some examples here. So we represent the real world in a GIS environment using a spatial data model. A spatial data model is what helps us to take the real world and decide how we're going to store the elements of the real world in a computer. Because a computer, we have to boil everything down to numbers. And so we have real world objects that we're going to put into our data model, and our data model will produce a thematic layer, a layer in GIS, which is a representation of the real world. All right, so in order to do that, we need to know where it is. We need to know what it is, which are its attributes. And sometimes we think about the real world as a bunch of things. Sometimes people would say features or objects. And one way that we conceptualize things, like buildings and roads and rivers, is that we think of them as points, lines, or polygons. And these are best modeled in what we call the vector data model. Okay? But we're going to be using the raster data model this semester, focusing on that. So all data models, though, have to have the ability to store where information. In other words, where is the thing that we're modeling? And they have to be able to store what information. In other words, the attributes. Okay. So in the vector data model, we store things as polygons, and we store their attributes in associated attribute tables that you see on the bottom. Okay. And so the polygons are actually stored as a bunch of XY locations. What do those XY locations mean? We usually don't have to worry about the machine code, so let's just ignore that for a second. Okay, well, for a long time, we'll just ignore it. Okay, we're not converting anything into machine code, and we actually rarely see the coordinate structure in a vector data set. But what do those represent? What kind of coordinates are those?
Polar coordinates. You say polar coordinates?
Sorry, what did you say down on the coast?
What kind of coordinates? Are you talking about polar coordinates?
Yeah, well, they can be different types of coordinates. So hopefully in your introductory GIS course, you learned about different coordinate systems and projections. That was an important topic. And so these coordinates that are stored about each one can be, like you said polar coordinates. That's probably most similar to like to geographic or spherical coordinates with latitude and longitude. Now these obviously aren't, well, I guess they could be latitude and longitude, but those, 1 degree, 4 degrees would be pretty far apart. These are probably Cartesian coordinates that are projected on a flat surface, so assuming that the Earth is flat. And so that's how this is how the where information is stored in a table that you rarely see, but there is a table, and it contains a bunch of coordinates for every polygon in your data set. And then there is another table that you do see that contains the attributes, that might contain attributes like how big the river, the wetland in this case is, or what type of wetland it is. So in the raster data model, it's a little different, okay? Which you probably discussed this in your last class, but instead of storing points, lines, and polygons in a file, we drape a tessellation over the surface of the Earth. And the tessellation is an evenly spaced, I'd like to say grid, but it's not always a grid, but almost always it's a grid. An evenly spaced grid over the Earth. Now when I say evenly spaced, what that implies is that every grid cell, when you can think of it as being on the Earth, has the same length and width, every single grid cell. There are a few exceptions. I guess technically they could all have the same width and then have a different length. But that's not usually done in practice. So in other words, you could have evenly spaced rectangles of rasters, right? But usually we do evenly spaced grids, rows and columns of data. And we can model points as taking place in just one grid cell. We can model lines as traveling through different grid cells and areas as taking up multiple grid cells. However, there is an inefficiency in doing that. Okay, so what happens is that every grid cell has to have a value in the raster data model. So not everywhere has to have a value in the vector data model, but everywhere has to have a value in the raster data model. So what that implies is that for your entire study area, or for your entire layer, there is a cell in every single layer. Now you might say, hey, look at this map of Mississippi. And I'm going to tell you it's a raster data model. Okay. What is the value, like right here? That's inside of this rectangle that encompasses that area. What's the value right there? Well, it's got a value. Oh, you can't see the mouse pointer. Let me hit escape here. What's the value right here? Right in that in the area that's in Louisiana, or the value right here of this raster cell. You don't even know what the value is right here, but what I'm trying to point out is that even in areas where you're not storing information, or you don't think that you want to store information, like right here, there is information stored. There's a number stored that represents no data. A number that represents no data. I wish it would allow me to show the pointer on this one. I guess I can do, I can like color. Can you see that? No, you can't even see that. Okay, never mind. Okay. So this is a raster that's storing what I would call categorical data. It's either a point or it's not. It's either in this line or it's not. It's either in the area or it's not. And typically it's not, and it's actually not organized very well. You wouldn't typically have data from 3 different layers, or data from 3 different data types in the same layer. But you could, okay? You would just have to code them different colors. Below, here's an elevation data set, a raster elevation data set, the one that's directly below the vector and the raster. And then here's an image to the right. An image is also a raster data set. Just to show you that you can actually have, different scientists have experimented with different tessellations. It's just easiest to use squares. Almost always, we're going to talk about raster data model. We're going to talk about squares. Okay? So our raster data sets are going to be a matrix of cells. Sometimes image processors might refer to those as pixels. They're the same meaning. So we can call them the cells, the pixels. They're the fundamental element in raster data. So we have rows and columns, and these cells are the fundamental element. So each cell contains a value, and that value is just a number. It's always a number. Even like, let's say this map right here that you see that looks kind of pixelated represented different land cover types. The green represented forests, the blue represented water, the yellow represented open fields, and the red represented buildings, let's say. Okay? And then we got one more color there. The kind of orange color represents open, bare or open areas, like exposed ground. Even in that case, what's actually stored in the raster data set are numbers. It's just a number. So in a categorical data set like this, you'll often have an associated table, but there's not any text stored in the raster data sets. It's always numbers. Numbers are what make up the raster data set. It's rows and columns of numbers. So a 1 might represent forest. So here's some examples of raster data: digital aerial photographs, satellites, digital pictures, even scanned maps. Here's some more raster data types. We've got some thematic elements here. Here is a land cover data set. Here's an elevation data set below it, next to numerical surface maps. So other examples include, like I said, temperature, precipitation. If it was a surface that represented water, it could be the dissolved oxygen content or just the salinity, things like that. I'll show an example of this. And then finally, raw images. This is a raw image. Now this is a special type of raster, and depending on the way you look at it, it could actually be 3 rasters. These two are the top 2 are just individual rasters. The bottom one is technically 3 different sets of numbers. I can see you well enough that I can see you raise your hand. Who's taken a course in remote sensing? It looks like about half of the coast, and course up here. So in remote sensing, you probably learned about imagery and what imagery consists of. It's basically just a raster data set, but we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. So this was, I think, yeah, so got 1 or 2 more slides on raster review here, but all right. So when we think about a raster data set, what's the value of an individual cell? Well, the value represents whatever that theme is trying to model in the real world. Okay? So when you create your own, you have to think about a few things. What is the bit depth? Anybody know what I mean by the bit depth? Like when a raster, I'm sure most of you have used raster data sets. What's the bit depth mean of a raster data set? Right, how many digits you can store in there. And maybe I should have said more specifically, it's the data type. There are a few different types of numbers that a computer can store. We're going to boil it down to a computer can either store a number that doesn't have a decimal place or a number that does have a decimal place. And so one of the ways to say that is an integer or a floating point number. And so all rasters actually will store either integers or floating point numbers, and then specifically they'll have different bit depths associated with that, which will tell how many different integers or how detailed of a floating point number that particular raster data set can store. And it actually has some important implications. So if you were trying to measure elevation and you were storing it using an integer, stored it as an integer number, what sort of implications would that have in terms of the number of values that you could store? You wouldn't be able to store half of it or a third or whatever.
So round off.
Right, you'd have to round off. So if you were storing meters, let's say, you're using meters as your units, and so you're storing elevation in meters, and you are mapping the coast of Mississippi, almost all your numbers would be the same, right? And you'd have some pretty abrupt changes. And so the bit depth matters a lot, but it also matters in terms of the size. Every single raster cell stores a number of the exact same size in your data set. So if it takes the computer 1 byte, which is 8 bits, to store the number, then if your cell is 1,000 by, if your raster is 1,000 by 1,000, you could say, well, that's 100,000. 1,000 times 1,000, 100,000. 1,000. It's 1 million. Sorry, it's 1 million bytes, which if you divide it by 1024, it would give you megabytes and so on. So it's easy to tell how big your raster data set's going to be once you know what the bit depth is. It's just a function of how big it is. Now there are different compression algorithms, but if you want to actually use it in GIS, it helps if it's uncompressed. It'll take a few seconds. In fact, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but most GIS software packages like to compute what we call pyramid layers. Have you ever seen when you load a raster data set, the computer asks, would you like to create pyramid layers? Okay. So what it's doing is it's actually magnifying, creating more and more data for you. It's creating a data set that is less detailed, a bunch of different less detailed data sets, so that when you display it, when you're zoomed out, it doesn't have to read the big data set. It only has to read the little data set.
So Dr. Raver, for something like that, that's a different bit depth for different magnifications, or am I understanding that right?
Actually, the bit depth stays the same, but
Okay.
the number of cells changes. So in what it does is it basically halves. So it starts with the original resolution, then it creates another data set that is, if the original resolution was 5 meters, then it'll, the cell size, then it'll create one where it's 10 meters on a side, and it'll find out what the average value is, and then inside that 10, that's what it's doing when it's calculating it. And then it'll do 20 meters on a side, and it'll keep doubling that actually.
Okay.
40 meters on a
So
side.
the bit depth doesn't change, it's the size of the cell.
That's correct. Yep. All right. Now, you also have to think of the extent. That's similar to other non-raster data sets. You're thinking, where am I going to study, and what's the extent that I have to deal with? But it's actually really important in raster data, because if you can half your study area, then you half the amount of data that you have to deal with. And so you need to consider your extent carefully, because it really has an effect on how big your data sets are. And some people might say, well, computers are getting better and better, which is true, but raster data sets are getting more and more detailed. And so it does matter in terms of your processing is your extent. And a raster data set will always be the same size. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'm going to try to go back to that other point where it's always a rectangle. So you're storing the information in a rectangle. It doesn't matter if you're storing no data in a bunch of cells. They're still storing a number, and they take up actually the same amount of room. So how do you represent no data? Sometimes you can represent it as 0, but sometimes it's more important to have a value that you store separately as no data. And then features can be represented in raster by just assigning every feature of a different type a different number. So if you only have 100 different feature types in your map, like let's say buildings, we wanted to store, we can only store one attribute in one raster. So if we have buildings and we want to store their name, we have, I don't know how many buildings we have on campus, but it might be a couple hundred. You need a couple hundred unique values in order to store that. If you just wanted to store how many floors each building was, then you could store a value that represented how many floors the building was. All right, let's think about how coordinates are assigned in a raster data set. It's a little bit different. So, well, I'll just go ahead and say this. The coordinates of every cell are not stored in a raster data set. Only one coordinate is actually stored with every raster data set, and that is one of the corners. Different formats specify which corner is going to be saved. It's not something you normally need to think about, but it's important in that it actually helps define the coordinates for the rest of the raster data set. Because once you have a corner established and you know your cell size, that defines the rest of the map. So the coordinate of any other cell can be inferred by its row and column, its distance from the corner. Sorry, was somebody about
So
to...
if you're, yeah, I'm sorry. If you're creating a raster, do you determine it, or does the software determine it for you?
It typically depends on how you're creating it. One of the times, in one of the labs, we'll use what's called an ASCII format. And the ASCII format lets you specify what the corner is, and then you could specify that. If you're just going to convert an existing data set, you have to specify where your raster data set's going to start, and then it will build cells from that start. You could say, use this extent that I have pulled up on my GIS data set. But it'll always be a little bit different than that exact extent because it needs an even number of cells. You can't have a half of a cell in a raster data set. So that concept of cell size, some people refer to that as the spatial resolution. And that also has an implication on what you can do with the data. So, for example, I have this elevation data set of Mississippi that's in the upper right-hand corner right now. It's a 30-meter resolution, so there's 30 by 30 meters. So I'm not going to be able to plan or to even really know what the highest elevation on campus is with this 30-meter data set because the resolution, in other words, I can't resolve anything smaller than 30 by 30 meters, and I'm likely either getting the maximum or the mean elevation within that 30 by 30 meter rectangle. And so it has implications in accuracy that you'll see throughout the course as we model different things. All right, now some of you said that you've already taken a raster GIS course. A image processing GIS course or remote sensing course, and talked about this concept. But raster bands don't just have to do with imagery, but they certainly are often used in imagery. So a band is technically its own raster data set, but many raster formats allow you to store a group of bands and call that one raster data set. So in reality, you're actually storing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, sometimes thousands of raster data sets in a single file, and you're referring to it as a single raster data set, when in reality, it's kind of like it's a multi-dimensional data set where there's a number of different rasters and they all represent something different. In the case of imagery, it's usually different amounts of reflected energy, red, green, and blue. But we could have a data set where each raster band represented a different slice in time, or it represented a different depth. Like let's say we're doing with ocean data, which is one of the data sets I'm going to show today, and there's multiple raster layers at each depth, and every depth is a different raster band. Okay. So the thing about raster bands is that they are different data sets, but you just don't see them, but they're always spatially coincident. In other words, they exist in the same space. They have the same extent. Now, more and more often, which I'm not going to talk about right now, more and more often we find people storing what we call a raster mosaic. Sometimes there's different words for it. But a raster mosaic, or sometimes it's referred to as a raster catalog, is a way to store multiple raster data sets in the same data set that aren't necessarily spatially coincident, but they can be. They can be totally different data sets collected at different times. And we'll get into some of that in this course, but that's not what we're talking about right here. We're talking about raster bands, meaning that they all have the same spatial extent. Sometimes they have different cell sizes, but usually they have the same cell size. So images, like even if you take a picture with your digital camera, although that's not technically a raster data set because it doesn't have any coordinates associated with it, it does have separate bands. One that represents the amount of red light that was reflected back, one that represents the amount of blue light, and one that represents the amount of green light that was reflected back. All right. Okay, we'll just get through this, and then we'll take a little break while I get everybody signed up for ArcGIS that wants to sign up. Okay, so we can store points, lines, and polygons. As I've mentioned, it's a little bit cumbersome. Okay, typically what you want to do is keep your points, lines, or polygons stored in the vector data format until you have to. At some point, if you're going to do an analysis where you're going to combine, like let's say I want to find out, I have a road, and I want to find out the highest point along that road. At some point, I need to do a raster to vector conversion in order to answer that question. Okay, I could either convert the road to vector. The elevation to vector, which isn't really going to work, or I can convert the roads to raster and find out which cell that the road touches is the highest. That's what this is. So that's one of the things we'll be learning about in this course is asking that exact question. Okay? The highest value in a certain area, things like that. So here's a road. I can convert the roads into polygons, into points, into a raster, and then find out which one of these rasters has the highest elevation. Okay. However, if I do that, let's see if it goes to the right page. Yeah, okay. If I did that conversion, let's say I converted these, and I found out that this grid cell right here, can you guys see where I'm pointing? This gray grid cell right there, if that one had the highest value, okay, what would I want to communicate, let's say, to the user about that value? And I said, okay, the highest point along your road is 723 meters above sea level. It's pretty high. What would I want to also communicate about that? See that one I'm pointing to? Notice how the line just barely passes through it. Okay. What might be some problems with that number that I came up with? Yeah, it could be the maximum height, or even if it was the mean, it might not be coincident with where the road is. And so, if it might not be a problem if these grid cells are like, a meter wide, a meter by a meter, then, I could tell them, well, within a meter, it's right, and relative to the other cells, maybe it's nothing. So I'd have to look and investigate. But if these grid cells are 30 by 30 meters, there could be a cliff, and it could actually not really match that value. And so whenever we when we convert points, lines, or polygons, we need to think about that. Those implications that have to do with accuracy, and report that to whoever the end user is that's asking the question, whether that's ourselves or somebody else. Yeah.
Do those rasters, they over exaggerate maybe the particular road that you're traveling on? So, like I said, it's not pinpoint exactly, but it's giving you the middle point for the road.
You're right. Yeah. So when we convert a line feature to a raster data set, we have to choose which cells we're going to say are part of that line. And we can't say a cell we can't say, well, that cell is not part of that line. or it's like half of part of that line. We have to say it's either in the cell or it's not in the cell. I mean, it's either in the line, it's either part of the line or it's not part of the line. And you can see there's two different ways to do that. Any cell rule here or the nearest rule. One of the weaknesses here is that it makes it so the line isn't contiguous, okay, which wouldn't really be very good for a road. Okay. But there might be some reason why you'd want to do that. But yeah, the cell size is going to determine how, in your words, how exaggerated that line is. Maybe generalized would be another synonym that I might use in that case. But the line may or may not be where the road really is. The road has a real thickness associated with it. And it'd be great if those matched up as much as possible. But sometimes we're dealing with data that already exists in the real world. So yeah, those are all great points that you're bringing up for sure. Now, things that are already continuous fields, like any statistical surface that I've mentioned, elevation, or something more abstract like population density. What's the population density of where I am right now? You know, that actually depends a lot on the cell size. If it's a 1 meter cell size, the population is 1, maybe 2. Maybe Dan's in my 1 meter cell. Okay, but if the cell size is 5 meters, then the population density here would be 4 because there's 4 of us. And I guess density would be per meter. So, but my point is it would change based on the cell size. And so statistical surfaces can be abstract like that, and they can be actually derived from point data sets. So sometimes you could take a point data set that might represent population and turn it into a continuous field like population density, and that is something that we'll address or talk to. Sometimes it could be a point elevation data set that we were converting to a continuous field elevation data set. In other words, a raster, an evenly spaced grid of elevation data from an unevenly spaced arbitrary point data set. In fact, in practice, that's how a lot of raster data sets are created. We don't actually know the elevation everywhere, right? Like we only can find out the elevation somewhere. There are better and better tools for doing that. Who knows? Did you guys talk about LiDAR in your remote sensing class? So we'll use a LiDAR data set several times in this class. And LiDAR, it bathes the Earth in these point data, and I'm simplifying a lot, but basically you get a point data set, and those points aren't evenly spaced, so if you want to turn them into a raster data set, which you most often want to do so that you can visualize it, then you have to make that conversion, to do that conversion. So that's one of the things that we'll talk about in this class is doing that. So that's a different type of raster to vector conversion. I mean vector to raster conversion. You can go back, okay, but going back is from raster to vector. But sometimes it's kind of like making, maybe this analogy is a little old, but making a copy of a copy of a copy of a cassette tape, it eventually gets worse. All right, let's see if there's anything else on there. Okay, yeah, so here, if we go back to one of those first slides where we talked about the what and the where information. So it's important to think about the basically the where information is the corner and the cell size, and that has a lot of implications on the the locational accuracy, also on the precision that's available, including the bit depth well, actually the bit depth has more to do with the attribute resolution. Okay, so you also have the dimensions, the rows and the columns, and then if you have a third dimension, that's the bands. Okay, you have various different bands associated with that data set. Okay. All right, you also have to have the what information, in other words, a mechanism to destroy it, to store descriptive information about the things, whether or not it's buildings or. So oftentimes, if you have an integer data set, you'll have an associated table, just like you would in the vector data model. But if you're not dealing with points, lines, and polygons, or things that can be modeled as point, lines, and polygons, typically you won't have that attribute table. So sometimes raster data sets have attribute tables, and sometimes they don't, is the summary for that. So, but they still all have a number associated with them, and the attribute table might have the name of, let's say, land cover, but the raster itself is still only storing the number. All right, let's go ahead and stop there for about 10 minutes. And what I'll do is check my email. I'm going to stop the video. I'm going to check my email, and anybody that wants to have signed up can do that. You don't have to. I'm going to bring it up here on the screen. So if you want to just follow along, that's fine. But if anybody wants to follow along on their own computer, I'm going to give you the ability to do that. So let's come back at 2:40. I'm going to stay here and do it, but I'm just going to disconnect the thing so everybody can't see each other's information. So if you send me that email, I'll set that up for you.